Your local writers group is crap. Stop burning off your free time in the presence of introverted do-nothings. Instead, join the Gosslings Writers Group Livestream and podcast. The Gosslings, a digital gang for writers. Writers who actually write stuff, who use typewriters. Writers who name their pit bulls Hemingway. Writers who write all the people who've ever offended them into their stories, then murder the shit out of them. The Gosslings. We don't always act pretentious, but when we do, we wear f***ing ascots. Welcome to The Gosslings.
Write like a man. Use a typewriter.
Yes.
Yes, baby. Welcome, everyone. I'm Jonathan.
I'm Nick.
And we are the Gosslings. And I will let Nick do the intro on this one since we're so excited. I might pee in my pants a little bit.
It could happen. Not that it's happened before.
No,
Or has it?
Not yet.
I don't know. Let us begin with our toast.
Yeah, let's do the toast. Lift up your libations if you have them, and Nick will start, and we will all follow.
Take up the broken sword of your father.
And strike down the darkness.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Mmm.
Pretty good. What is it?
Bullet Frontier Rye Whiskey.
Frontier Rye.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Good choice.
Yeah.
And not too hard on the bank account. Still.
No, it's not.
Probably costs less than a gallon of gas at this point.
It does per gallon. Yes, I can get a gallon of this for less than a gallon of gas right now. Well, we have a very special treat. Mr. Gary Wayne has returned. I'm going to introduce him as someone who knows more about what is going on in the world, what has gone on in the biblical past, and how to interpret that for today, probably than anyone I've ever met. He's phenomenal. He's written this book. We'll talk more about that.
The Genesis 6 conspiracy.
And I'm about to bring him on right now, ladies and gentlemen, the chronicler of the gods with a lower G, the man of myth and legend, the Christian contrarian, and esoteric librarian, the keeper of the keys to the vault of all things the pastors are too afraid to talk about, the illuminator himself, ladies and gentlemen, Gary Wayne.
Gary Wayne. What's up, Gary?
Hello, sir.
Hello. So happy to be with you with 1 hour less sleep.
Right. Yeah.
Right on the cusp of the time change on the back end.
Yeah.
So hopefully I can make some sense today and not sound like a person who has to have X amount of hours of sleep every night, which I do.
Yeah, me too.
Well, you don't look like you're suffering in any way. You look like you've had the ample amount of coffee, the required amount. And so, no, I wouldn't have known if you hadn't said anything.
Yeah, hale and fresh.
There was definitely an extra large cup dose down of coffee today. There's no doubt about that.
I think I mentioned it in the email. I'm pretty sure, I'm convinced that that daylight savings time must be part of Nephilim culture, because there's no way taking an hour of sleep away from us is of the Lord. You know,
it's part of that fallen angel technology.
It's that Hegelian dialectic that, you get an hour here, but we take an hour here. Problem, reaction, solution.
It's kind of like having them withhold from your taxes. Oh, we're going to give you more when you file. We'll give it back.
Yeah, it's kind of akin to the deal with the devil. Yeah, for a short period of time you're going to like it, but then it's going to be really ugly when I come back to fulfill the contract here. So.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, Gary, you have an awesome website. You have an amazing book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy. You've been on a ton of podcasts, ton of live streams. We're always honored to have you. Your book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, is probably, at least as far as I've seen, the definitive compendium on, I would call it Christian esoterica, but how would you describe the Genesis 6 conspiracy for people?
Well, it's certainly unlike any book you're going to find on the marketplace. And there's a lot of book out there about giants. There isn't, I don't think, a book out there that connects all the sort of different aspects about what other people in terms of civilizations and religions believe about them, and how that sort of intersects with what's told in the Bible, and how the polytheist religions and mythologies view that and through their polytheist lens, and bring that together so that you can understand what's going on in the Old Testament, and then sort of link that into prophecy to a certain degree. So what I like to say is it tells sort of the most complete story, maybe not the deepest story, because I have another book that's going to come out that's totally devoted to the Christian side, because what I learned throughout talking on talk shows and taking questions and receiving social media and emails, and I spend 3 or 4 hours a day just answering the social media for people who have questions. So don't be afraid to get a hold of me if you got a question or looking for a document. I will get back to you. It might take a little bit of time, but I will get back to you. But what I learned from that is they wanted to know how much more is in the Bible about giants that maybe I left out, because I took out like 350 pages on the first book to get it down to a size to be published. And how does that connect into prophecy more? And so that's what this book is going to be all about. And people are absolutely looking for more information. And there's so much more information about prehistory in the Bible than what most people think, and so much more about prophecy. And you would think they were very, very small components, except they're the largest components of the Bible, because churches don't teach either. And so it's and if you don't have the context from what happened and where we're going, then it's really hard to understand the full message and prepare ourselves for not only the world that we live in, and if we are indeed in the fig tree generation, then what's coming.
Yeah. Why do you think churches shy away from these topics?
Well, the first thing is that they're taught not to teach this in seminary schools, both in the Roman Catholic Church and in the Protestant seminaries as well. And there's a sort of this superficial, specious reason for doing it, because it's too nebulous, it's too obscure, you don't want to be wrong, you don't want to lose your credibility, you don't want to talk about things that maybe isn't publicly acceptable, seemingly with giants, or how do we understand prophecy properly, understanding there's a lot of pitfalls in there. So that's the superficial reason. The real reason is that the Gnostics and the polytheists have infiltrated Christianity at all levels, and particularly control the curriculum at the seminary schools, and they're just not taught this subject. And I get a lot of ministers who get a hold of me and say, can I get some material on this, because we weren't taught this in seminary schools. And so I think that's what's really going on, and it's sort of akin to critical race theory that's currently happening in public schools. It's the same MO. It's what, once they get a hold of the curriculum, they get control of what people believe.
Yeah, absolutely. So the new book, it's going to focus more from a Christian perspective, is on the Nephilim specifically, or are you going to cover, because you cover so many topics in this?
We do. It's and this is not going to be a small book either. I'm on chapter 57 right now. It's going to be 70 or 75 chapters. It won't be quite as big, so I can save a little bit on the shipping costs. Just kidding.
Good.
But it's going to be packed with information, because what I wanted to do is to do a number of things that I think people are looking for. I wanted to understand the angelic order and how that interplays. So I'm going to cover off the hierarchy, the different kinds of angels, how that mixes into Mount Hermon and the Council of Gods. And I'm going to explain how you sort of go from there to understand the world that we're in, and then why they produce these giants, and then explain sort of all the different names and tribes, so that they know where they fit, how they affected our history in terms of the biblical history from, after the flood, and where the peoples come from, because there's so many names, and I talk a little bit about it in the first book, that there's a lot of names that don't show up in the Table of Nations. Well, I'm going to dive deeper into that. Cool. And we're going to arrive at a place where you understand why there's some confusion with the Canaanites, because you have 9 patriarchless Canaanite clans that I'm going to use through archaeology, the understanding of how patrial names were done for places and locations, the patronymic aspect of the names. I'm going to work that back to give you a plausible understanding as who the Rephaim patriarch for those 9 tribes that produce the ones that are taller than the Israelites, that's talked about in Numbers 13, but not the Anakim, but a separate people, and as Deuteronomy 1 talks about. Then I'm going to sort of walk through the history of Israel in terms of how they interplayed with these people in terms of the wars. And I'm going to walk through each of the campaigns, and we're going to interconnect all of these giant nations into it. And then we're going to take that right through to the Davidic Wars and the King Saul Wars, and even into Solomon with that patronymic dynasties of Horim in particular, as you get into the time of King Solomon, and show that these were still Rephaim-led countries with royal dynasties that were still ruling the countries that Israel that was warring against. And all the way through that in the first part of the book as I do that, and then talk about all the different names of giant nations that people hadn't thought of or connected them to be giant nations. You got the obvious ones like the Emim and the Zamzuzim. I'm going to cover them too in more detail than I did in the first book, but I'm going to give you all the other names. And in those sections of the book, I'm going to connect that prehistory of that to how that fits into end time prophecy. So when I get into end time prophecy in the last couple of sections of the book again, I'm going to roll that information forward so that you can understand the language of end time prophecy and how you can sort of connect who these bloodlines and descendants are as it talks about these royal families in the end time, and how we can sort of take that back. And the difficulty is that the New Testament was written in Greek as it was copied down as opposed to Hebrew. So, words like Gibborim don't automatically just show up as Gibborim in Greek. So how do you get back to those root words that the Jewish people who were the disciples and the apostles at that time, right, would have understood those peoples and those bloodlines. And so I'm going to connect sort of all of that back. And it's a project that is really, really fun. I haven't already got down to a nutshell, elevator speech in terms of what it is, but it's going to be the Genesis 6 conspiracy part 2, prehistory, prophecy, and Rephaim.
Nice.
Really
Is that the title? That's the title? Genesis 6 conspiracy part 2?
Yeah, that's how I want to brand it and do it off the same website. And
cool.
And what I didn't want to be is I didn't want to be redundant in this book. So there's some obvious things that you have to do to make the premise for what you're talking about that's in the old book. But I'm presenting like 90% all new information.
Oh, man, that's fantastic. Man. I cannot wait. Do you have kind of a timeline on when you think that might happen?
Well, my problem is I just want to put too much in all the time. So
do it.
I wanted it out for January, so I'm already behind that. I'm still trying to target it to have it in the publisher's hands by the summer and have it out, in the summer or certainly before Christmas. But I'm gonna make sure it's under 75 chapters and get it done, because you can literally almost write forever on this stuff. So
right. Yeah.
But when you get into like the War of Giants, I mean, there's just so much material in that in Genesis 14, and people don't make those associations and how all of those peoples and those names, where they came from, and what's that sort of connection into what happens in the time of the Exodus. And so it's just so much fun that I just love doing the research. And it's going to have a pretty impressive bibliography again, but again, only enough of the outside stuff to do what I have to do in there. So most of it's going to be like using some really good sourcing for backup information and sourcing that comes out of like Ellicott's commentary, or Strong's Cyclopedia, which is the original. These are all 1800 encyclopedias on the Bible, and using Strong's. I do a lot of taking the word back to Greek and Hebrew and explaining the word to people so they get the full context of that word in English and why it's important to understand, for understanding prophecy, for understanding polytheism, for understanding giants, fallen angels, and what's going on in terms of that sort of.
Do you find that the older encyclopedias and concordances, 100 years old or more, do you feel like they are meatier, richer? Do you feel like the newer stuff has been maybe scrubbed clean of some possible definitions?
Scrubbed clean and not as much meat on it. And they all are using the same sources. They just condensed it down. And so, I mean, I love Unger's Bible Dictionary and Nelson's Bible Dictionary, but they're all sourcing from, Strong Cyclopedia. I mean, they're just not putting it all in there.
So you're going back to the source to get the full definition, right?
As best as I can, yes, because I think it's important that people, because the Bible would be a lot bigger if the English translators either wanted or had the ability to translate the fuller context of the word. Instead of trying to use one word, use more words to explain the full meaning, right? And you have to be careful too, because it's got to be, once you start doing that, then you have to be careful you're not running into contradictions in other passages. And in each Greek word and Hebrew word, they can have several meanings. So it has to make sense in the narrative and the sentence that it's in. And it also has to be consistent in terms of whatever else you're adding in there for the fuller explanation is consistent with what would be translated and written elsewhere in the Bible. So it would be a big project, but the difference is as the Jewish people understood the Bible or would have understood it being documented into Greek, is they understood those words in the larger context. And it was just sort of understood that people understood that context.
Yeah, nobody owned. And what's amazing about that is you didn't have every Jewish family with their own, copy sitting on a shelf at home. In different translations. They went to the synagogue, and that's where the scrolls were brought out and read to people.
Yeah,
and they still had a more contextual, tighter understanding of what was going on.
Take one word, for example, like Rapha, which is used 25 times in the Old Testament for giants, and people don't realize it's listed that many times. It may not always say Rapha or Rephaim. Most times in the King James, only twice do you get Rephaim, right? Which is the same word as giant that's used 25 times in the Old Testament. And so Rapha has a root word and two words that branch out of it. And the root word is 7495, which can mean as a healer or as a doctor or as a physician, that's part of the meaning to the Rephaim, as being sort of had this ability to sort of self-heal, because that's why you had to behead them, to strike them quickly and make sure they couldn't repair themselves. But they also understood the word Rapha as meaning shade, or Sidhe, as it's understood in occultism as a shay. Or a spirit, or a demon spirit, right? Or it also was part of the word the other word was for giant and a tribe of giants, right? So they understood when you said Rapha, they're thinking all of those sort of meanings that could be being used and understood in context. So they didn't have to do a whole bunch of more explanation. It's resonated with them with those different meanings as being akin to each other.
Yeah. Man.
So real quick, for anybody who is, there's something in there I really want to touch on.
Yeah, sure.
But for anybody who is unsure of the informational depth that Gary Wayne goes through, the Genesis 6 Conspiracy is an 802 page book, 801 book, and the last 109, 110 pages there are 8 pages of bibliography in here. 8 pages. That's insane. And then there's another roughly 98 to 100 pages of endnotes. It's basically the last the last 100 pages of this book are just
It's reference.
material.
Yeah.
That's how
Yeah.
exhaustively researched. That's why I love Gary so much, because like Gary, you're like my kind of nerd, and like, you have the same enjoyment doing that stuff as I do, like researching ancient battles and military stuff. And it's just like, man, that's what you're passionate about, and it comes through. It's awesome. So,
Yeah, and so depending what the editors do on the endnotes on this book, it's going to have a lot more information in the endnotes. So I'm going to make sure, as best as possible, when I'm using a source, I'm also, if they're using ancient sources, citing those sources specifically and the page number and everything that sort of goes with it. And if I'm citing like the Cyclopedia, I'm giving maybe a condensed down, or the concordance in this case, I'm going to be giving a condensed down translation of the definition of the word, because it gets very verbal and verbose, and instead of just copying and sort of pasting it type of thing, I'm just going to condense it down to the meanings and put that in there. But you get the different meanings, and you get the number of the word, and then you can look at the place where it's put in the Bible. Which meaning do I think fits that verse?
Well, that's the hard thing about editing, whether in your case you could take the full breadth approach, where you take a word and you spend 2 sentences contextualizing it, but you want to be kind of as concise with your dispensation of information as possible. And like, I have that problem from a writer's perspective, of typically less is more. But the problem you run into, instead of saying, like just a fundamental pure writing thing, he ran quickly, you could say he sprinted, So it's that concept. But when you start condensing, it unfortunately leaves more room to or misinterpretation.
Yes.
So in a subject like this, it must be tough, like finding that balance.
It is. And because there's so much, it's a large book, you want to be, as economic as many words as you're going to be using, right? Because again, that adds to the cost as well, and you don't want to lose people in too much of the minutia, which is why there needs to be a sort of good, in my opinion, interplay, particularly with this next book for Christians, the interplay between the endnotes and the text. And I think the reader will very quickly learn that you're going to be wanting to have that endnotes as your companion as you're reading through. And so I would like to have, we'll see what the publisher does with it, but instead of putting the endnotes at the end, I would like to have it as footnotes on each sort of page as it goes through, so that that information is there.
Yeah, it's more fluid that way. People can just reference.
Well, they're going to be more likely to check them and learn, as opposed to going to the back of the book. Because with endnotes, I would assume that very few people actually, when they see the mark, the indicator, they very rarely go back and read the actual foot in the back or the endnote.
Well, and it gets tiring, right? And at some point, you just say, you know what? He's citing sources on everything. I'm not going to check everyone.
That's what I did. Keep reading. Yeah, that's what I did. It's like, you know what?
Yeah, I'm
just going to roll with it. Yeah. He knows more than I do, clearly. So, who might? Right. Do you want to mention the?
Real
comments?
Quick before our first question, couple comments in the chat. Brian Tucker says, "Hey Gary." Heather Ann says, "Hi, Mr. Gary Wayne. So great to see you." And then Brian also mentioned, this is interesting, Brian Tucker says, giants were turned into stone here at Giant City State Park in Maconda, Illinois. I don't know if you've ever heard of that or looked at that at all. I've never heard of that.
Well, I've not seen those, but in First Nation history, and particularly prominent in Central America with the Quiche Maya, it has the giants in a couple different sort of versions. One where they're created from the stones, and then one as they're getting rid of them, they're turned back into the stones. So there's obviously some sort of connection there throughout North America with that sort of understanding of what happened to the antediluvian giants, because this happens at the time of the flood, as opposed to the other, and typically all red-haired giants that show up in First Nation, Central and South American mythology after the flood. That's typically associated with the white snake clan, let's say, as the Hopi would call it, who came from an island, which is thought to be Atlantis, as you sort of connect some of the dots on that. But there's this white snake clan of giants that show up after the flood that's sort of common throughout North and South America, and they seem to be the Aboriginal peoples right after the flood.
Really? Okay, so we're gonna I'm gonna dovetail totally into something else.
Yeah.
Because it brings up Atlantis. So there's always the argument or the conversation: where is Atlantis? You know, or where was Atlantis? If there is this diaspora of Atlanteans that happened after the cataclysm, A, is the cataclysm the flood? B, is the Atlantis that we are often referring to just an antediluvian Nephilim culture society? And C, where do you think, if it was a continent, a singular continent, do you have any opinion on where it might have been?
Yeah, a lot of thought there for sure in the questions. So
take whichever of those you want, whichever ones you're interested in.
Well, the first thing is yes, I do think I'll start at the end and maybe work my way back, is that it was a Nephilim culture. It is a parallel story to Genesis 6:1-4, which is the preamble to the flood. And so you have in the Atlantean account, and I really like to rely heavily on Plato and Critias and Timaeus in terms of the accounts, because according to that, the details came off of columns in Egypt that were written down by Solon, and so you get a little bit more of the ancient historians' history and accounting of it, and the details just seem to be a little bit more relevant and consistent with what we know biblically about the antediluvian world, and consistent with other accounts kind of around the world. So you have Poseidon, who's an offspring god, and he is going to take a human female named Clymene. And in the ancient definition of demigod, that's the offspring of a god and a human female that would create a hero, a titan, an earthborn titan, and what we would understand as a Nephilim in the Bible. And he creates 10 of those kings. So they're 10 Nephilim kings with 10 royal bloodlines. And this is the new Atlantis that Bacon is talking about for the end time. And so in that accounting, you're getting not just a flood of the destruction of Atlantis, you're getting a conflagration of events. You're getting, in some accounts, 3 asteroids from the Pleiades that are striking the ocean that would start the flood. But you're also getting earthquakes, and you're also getting seemingly volcanoes, and you're getting more than just the rain in the destruction. And we actually get a little bit more of that in the Bible as well, and I covered those details off in the Atlantis chapter in the first book, the Genesis 6 conspiracy, and that you get accounts that are talking about a time when God's wrath is sort of coming out, and the bottoms of the seas are laid bare, right? I mean, what would cause that? And when would have that happened? The only way it sort of lines up is with a larger sort of event, and you get these earthquakes that are going on, and so I list all of those out. I won't get too far into the minutia of it. So biblically, we can say, hey, there was a flood, but there's some other details that we may want to fully understand, just as the Bible talks about the Orion and the Pleiades and all of these other things that are talked about in polytheism that they associate with the flood. In fact, so much so in the polytheist Babel accounts afterwards, they are going to do a temple at the bottom of the Babel Tower that they say were helped built by the giants after the flood, but a temple that's devoted to the flood and to the 3 asteroids of the Pleiades, or the 3 stars of the Pleiades that crash into the ocean. And so it's very strong in polytheism. And then in that culture of mystical black magic that comes out of Atlantis, that's the Enochian mysticism at its apex, the Enoch son of Cain, that develops the 7 sciences, that develops the mystical religion that merges with the knowledge from the gods or the fallen angels as we understand it. And this is that religion that's going to cross the flood, that's going to show up at Babel again, that Nimrod is going to be given that information, that knowledge and that religion, impose it on the Noahites, and use that knowledge to build Babel City and Babel Tower. And we have accountings that come from this Atlantean flood story, because I think it's the same story. I think it's just the polytheist lens from sort of a Greek accounting of it, ancient Greek, antediluvian Greece. And you have 7 sages that are serpent-like Rephaim-type beings, or Nephilim-type beings, that are part of the survivors that go into the lands of the world. Individuals like Quetzalcoatl or Osiris, as they connect back into it, that re-educate the survivors after the flood, because in the polytheist version, giants and humans survived the flood, and in many places around the world, not just the Noah story. So they have this accounting on all provinces. So you get these 7 sages that show up in Egypt. You get them in the Popol Vuh. You get it in the 7 sages of India, and it's all sort of part of that sort of how this knowledge crosses the flood from one aspect of it. And the other aspect is the secret societies, that the bulk of the knowledge is found by Hermes hidden underneath the pyramids, right, in 36,525 books and 9 vaults buried beneath the Great Pyramid. And so I tend not to think that giants survived the flood, but polytheism leans more towards that, whether or not it's the giants escaping out of Tartarus into Scythia after the flood as one specific account, or in stories that emulate the biblical ark story, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is all polytheism and giants. These are not humans that are surviving in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh is created after the flood, even though, like in the Book of Giants and other antediluvian accounts that stray quite a bit from the Bible, there's also a Gilgamesh before the flood. But it's not uncommon for you to have a Hercules after the flood and a Hercules before the flood. So they would take the same name, just as the offspring gods rise up to take the place of the parent gods, like Baal taking over for El, the Baalim gods after the flood, because I think the offspring gods went to the abyss for their crimes. And so I think that when you have that sort of kind of understanding, that polytheism looks at giants surviving the flood, as in the Epic of Gilgamesh, to bring this back around. Understand, Gilgamesh is 2/3 God and 1/3 human. He's a demigod, right? Mm-hmm. And it's interesting with that 1/3 and 2/3 sort of equation to it.
Yeah.
So Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh is said to be who Noah is based on, except that Utnapishtim is also 2/3 God, 1/3 human. His whole family is 2/3 God, 1/3 human. It's a giant survival story. So they have a second incursion in there with Gilgamesh and Enkidu being created after the flood, and they have a survival on an ark. And even in the Greek mythology, you have Deucalion, who's called the Greek Noah, and Pyrrha as his wife. And what's interesting about that, that's got nothing to do with humans either, because Deucalion's the son of Prometheus. And Prometheus is either going to be a Nephilim or more likely one of the offspring gods, right? Yeah. And so this has got nothing to do with being a human survival story. This is the polytheist lens on the royal bloodlines that they're tracking through their literature. So I'm not convinced that you had the 7 sages after the flood. That's their mythology. What I do believe is their knowledge crossed the flood. Their religion crosses the flood, and it shows up again, and we first see it at Babel.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I have a question actually about the Nephilim, the bloodlines. In Revelation 13, John sees when John's having his vision, he sees the beast rising, and it has 7 heads and 10 horns. Do you think that the 10 horns might correlate to the the bloodline of the 10 Nephilim kings?
Oh.
Well, and that's kind of the case I'm kind of making in the first book, and then I'll get even more into that into the second book. So when you look at Revelation 13, you see that same beast that shows up in Revelation 12 that's waiting for the child, right? The Messiah
dragon,
to be born. Exactly the same empire that is sponsored by the dragon. And also understand this is like a Leviathan type of dragon, multiple heads, 7 heads, right? And it's also the red dragon, which is also associated, as you get it out of Revelation 12, with Satan as well. So, and then you see that same beast that's being ridden in Revelation 17. Now, this is all an extended meanings of what happens in the book of Daniel. So that in Revelation 13, you get this beast, and it has traits of the lion, it has traits of the leopard, and it has traits of the bear.
Mm-hmm.
Which are separate beast empires that come before the terrible one, which is the 4th that's talked about in Daniel 7. That's the one that's of iron that will then separate into the 2 legs, which became, I think, the 2 halves of the Roman Empire, Constantinople and Rome. And then you have the 10 toes that are extended out of it. And I'm sort of flip back to Daniel 2, which is telling a different allegory of 10 toes. But in Revelation, or in Daniel 7, it's talking about this empire that rises out of the old Roman Empire that also has 10 horns on it. And those 10 horns are, as they're talked about in Revelation 13, not only 10 horns, but 10 kings. And it's also associated, and 10 crowns. And
crowns, yeah.
and 7 crowns as well on the empires as you go Revelation 13, 12, and 17, as you put all that sort of information together. And so this is a connected beast empire, just as the statue is one beast, one statue, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, and it's all sort of fitting together in sort of the bloodlines, right? And so in Daniel 2, you get this interesting passage in Daniel 2, 42 to 43, as I recall on the verse, where you have this 10-toed empire, which is the 10 kings, which is the 10 horns, that they will mix with their seed with human seed in the end time. That's an absolutely bizarre sort of understanding. And that in Psalm 21, verses 19, 20, and 21, as I recall, it talks about the time of the wrath. And that at the time of the wrath, there's going to be a reckoning to this fruit and to this seed that's on the earth, and be removed from the children of men. So there's a separate race that's being talked about. And I think that's where these 10 kings come from in the end time, is that they are descendants of the Rephaim after the flood. I'm open to the fact that there could be Nephilim that are in clone bodies or whatever that are going to be part of those 10 kings. But what we do get that we can put our hands on for sure is that the royal families have genealogies that take them back to these beast empires, right?
Yeah.
Oh,
and
yeah,
yeah. And so I think these are the descendants of the Rephaim that are going to make up this 10 king empire of the end time. So when I look at the 7 heads, that's the 7 beast empires. And those beast empires are the empires that are associated with Israel. So Egypt is the one where Israel is brought into a nation, and then you have the Exodus. Assyria is the one that takes the northern tribes into exile for breaking the covenant. And then you have Babylon, who's going to be the empire that takes the southern kingdom into exile. Then you have the Persians and the Medes, who are going to permit the Jewish people to go back and to build the temple. And then you've got the period of Alexander and his empire, who invade the land, and there's an abomination like happening that happens there as well. And it's important to understand the other parallel prophecy of the Greek Empire. And then you have the Roman Empire that actually comes out of the Greek Empire as the next one that is going to destroy the temple. It's the time of the Messiah and the crucifixion, and you have the exile of Judea into the rest of the world, only visible, as opposed to the lost tribes of Israel. So the end time empire is going to be deeply connected to Israel and Judah as well, just as the 8th empire, which is Antichrist, will also be heavily influential on it. And it's interesting that Michael, he doesn't prevent the empires from coming about. He fights them. I think what he's fighting is preventing the Antichrist to come to power until he sits down, as he's described sitting and then rising again at the midpoint of the last 7 years in Daniel 12 and the time of the war in Revelation 12. So I think when we look at how the beast empires are formed and who they are, we need to look at that relationship with Israel, because it's all about Israel and who's grafted into the covenant, which are the Christians. And you also have Daniel 8, which also has additional meanings to help us understand end time prophecy, and is also part of those 7 heads. And it comes, and it's not a contradiction. It's a parallel dual prophecy that just provides us more information about where the Antichrist is going to come from in the end time and what he does. And so you have the Greek Empire as it's defined, and Alexander as who that would be, that's being prophesied as that king. His empire is going to split up into 4. So his empire is split into the 4 winds. So and so you have 5 empires there. Then out of that empire comes Rome, which is the 6th empire, and then the rise of that empire again in the end time empire. So again, you have the leopard that's represented in the body for Greece, and then you have still the other empires that are sort of represented from Daniel 7. So there's no contradiction there. But those are the 7 empires. And in Revelation 17, I know I'm down on a rant here, but in Daniel 17, you have the 7 hills that are also entered in, and the 7 kings, not either or. It has 7, it represents 7 hills, and this is probably to do with Babylon and the woman, and it's the 7 kings. And those 7 kings are like 7 Antichrist-like figures, right, from those beast empires. Just as Antichrist is the 8th. So you can imagine certain ones in there, and probably I would put the Pharaoh in at the time of the Exodus, who wanted to destroy Israel from the face of the earth at the foot of the Red Sea, right? He's went out there to absolutely destroy them. You know, you have the Assyrian king that did the exile. That would be that sort of Antichrist. You have Nebuchadnezzar, who almost completes the abomination at that time. He does the statue and he plunders into the temple, but he doesn't do it there. And you have Cyrus, who's maybe not an Antichrist-like figure, but he is one, you know, you have other kings in there, but Cyrus is the most influential, who kind of starts the whole thing rolling for the temple. But you could, you know, in the time of the Persian king of Ahasuerus, I mean, I hate those Medes, Persian kings. They just drive me crazy. But you have,
it always defeats our Caucasian tongue.
You have Haman the Agagite that's raised to being the head royal king of his vassal kings, who's out to destroy the remnant of Judea, and he comes from the Amalekite bloodline, right? And then you have after that you have a true Antichrist type figure in Alexander, right? I mean, he's considered like the two-horned devil in the Qur'an. I mean, this is thought to be an Antichrist type of figure. And you've got like Julius Caesar, what might be one, or you could pick the Roman Caesar that is around at the time of Jesus' crucifixion, or the Roman Caesar at the time of the death of Jesus, or I guess I just said that, or the one at the time of the destruction of the temple and the diaspora of the Jewish people. So you have these Antichrist type figures who don't come to full power. And I think that's who Michael is sort of fighting against. But they're also the seven kings of those seven Antichrist type figures, right? And we need to sort of understand that. And there's another one that's in there that I think is kind of interesting. There's two other kings that are kind of Antichrist-like figures in Ezekiel 32, which is Pharaoh, who is kind of like this, described as this beast from the waters, which is Hebrew Tannim, and is in Ezekiel 29, and it's actually translated as whale. Or I mean, it's whale in Ezekiel 32, but it's dragon in Ezekiel 29, and it's the same Hebrew word. And then you have Tyrus that's also involved, who is like a Antichrist type figure. So that's sort of all sort of interwedded into there, particularly with the Tyrus one, because that becomes, I think, that economic beast empire that end time Babylon will be, that is riding these seven empires of the world. And if you look at those beast empires, there's kind of three major components of it. You have like the king and the army and the empire, right? You have their mystical religion, which comes from Babel after the flood, which Babylon is rooted in. And then you have the power of its free trade and its commerce that is controlled. And what's interesting about Tyrus is that in Isaiah 23, you get an accounting of this destruction of Tyre that is described not only for the time of the prophecy and the time of Isaiah, and of course the Assyrian romp and rise to a beast empire, but it's also destroyed in the Babylon one. But you also have this island and these people that are escaping to sort of around the earth that might be, that a lot of polytheists would point to as the seven sages, and that this is an allegory of Babylon, which is an allegory for Atlantis before the flood, and that destruction as an island before the flood. And so I think we need to understand those things kind of in context as to what's going on with that beast in Revelation 13, but that these 10 kings that come up, they come out of all of these beasts. They come out of the extension of the metallic statue. And I think the bloodlines that are talked about in the book of Psalms that I talked about, and in Daniel 2, are referencing this bloodline that are going to be part of those 10 kings who are going to rule the earth once Babylon comes to power and brings about that 10 king groups of nations, spheres of influence, empires ruled by 10 kings in the end time.
Yeah. I know Nick probably wants to get to some of the cool comments we have in the chat, but I wanted to ask real quick, because it's kind of just a real short answer, I would assume. But you never know.
You never know with me.
So the 10 bloodlines, are they the ones that are all jockeying to have
Yes.
their bloodline be the one to usher in the Antichrist?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that's why Jesus is warning us that there will be multiple antichrists, as he talks about in Mark and Matthew. And also in the epistles of John is talked about multiple antichrists. And Gog, as you take that back to Greek and Hebrew, it's understood as an end-time antichrist type figure. That is probably fighting a counterfeit Armageddon battle that Antichrist will come to power on and take credit for winning. So, I think we need to understand it in those sort of terms, that what you will see not necessarily brought out at the geopolitical shuffling that's going to need to take place to bring about world government, and how it will go into the 10 groups of nations as without coincidence, the Club of Rome, which was formed in the late 60s, their agenda was to move the world into the direction of the 10 groups of empires that they split the world up into at that point in time. And so it's kind of akin to how this is going to come about to, if I could look at, let's say, First Nation tribes, which have the bloodline chiefs. And then of late, you have the elected councils, and they're all sort of jockeying for position, for power within those First Nations, right? And I think that's what is going on in the world today between the bloodlines of the Rephaim and the democracies that have come along. And there could be a mix of those kinds of kings in the end time. You could have some, the ones who have more pure descendant bloodlines. And then you could have maybe just kind of like some strongmen, right? That are going to be set up to run those groups of nations. And that may be what's being talked about in, the 2 legs that has the 2 feet on the 10 toes on 2 separate feet, that there could be that mix. And it could be similar to what Daniel 2:43 is talking about. Or you could see that split more as what we're starting to see from a China and Russia world order that is going to have maybe 5 that are with them, and there'll be 5 on the other side, but there will be this sort of tenuous working relationship that is starting to rise.
That's scary to think about.
But look for the bloodlines to be ever more increasing as we get to the core of what's going on in the world today, whether or not it's in Russia or whether or not it's in China or it's in Japan. Look for those genealogies. So a good example would be President Xi in China. And that's spelled X-I. And it's a short form and sort of the Western version of Shah, which is X-I-A. And the Shah was the bloodline and the original tribe of the kings and the dynasties of China. So he comes from the Western bloodline as opposed to the Eastern bloodline of the original kings created by the dragon creators since the flood. And again, I have a document on that for people if they want. And then you've got the original czars of the Cossacks that originally settled in the area, sort of north and east of the Black Sea, that eventually went into Moscow and set up their kingships there at a later time. And those some people call them Tartarians, and they're literally are connected back to the Cossacks and the Tartars, and the Tartarians comes from that. That area that is under attack today as the capital city is the original home of the original bloodlines of the original czars. And they were replaced in the 1600s with another royal bloodline, but by the Romanovs that people would be more familiar with. But what's interesting is about this original bloodline that's in the capital of that country that we were talking about, is that there's the leader of the Russian nation today, whose grandfather descends out of Kiev.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and his name comes out of nowhere in the 1850s. There's no Putin name before the 1850s.
Oh, no kidding.
So there was a royal bloodline of the original czars that were called the Putyanin. And in that tradition from there, that if they had children out of wedlock, they would not receive the whole name, they would give them a part name.
Interesting.
I love it.
Oh, that's so funny.
How do you find this?
I've got a document on this as well if people want it.
And people, if they want these documents, by the way, because I don't think we've ever really mentioned this, they can go to your website, genesis6conspiracy.com, and there's a section on there where you can contact Gary Wayne directly and request via email any of these documents.
And the Yamamoto bloodline in Japan descends out of the Shah or the Li dynasty out of China. Right. And so, but I would expect Japan to be a leader of another group of nations in the southeast as well. That would be, if it's going to be split 5 and 5, that would be part of that eastern, and the kings of the east, as they come to be known in the end time battle, will be forming. So you can imagine that there should be bloodlines then all around the world. So if we go back to the time of the exploration of the New World, and in particular into Mexico and into South America, you have all of these royal bloodlines that people think were lost to history. Well, of course they weren't. So what the Spanish did is they would kill the king at that time, but not the rest of the family. And by 1525 or so, you have a complete reinstatement of all of the rights of that family and bloodline afterwards. And then they start to intermarry with the Portuguese and the Spanish. So both of them work hand in hand to reinstate those bloodlines. They're vassal kings at this point, right? Vassal families, but they're going to intermarry with the bloodlines from Portugal and Spain. So you have families, I won't go through an endless list of names, but you have the Indiroca, which is thought to be the modern bloodline of the Incas, right? So you're going to have the Aztec bloodlines and the Matildas and many other families that come from Central America that have intermarried and are still sort of in that ruling class today that are going to sort of rise to control those end time groups of nations and empires. So I would look more in that sort of line. And so you could imagine then out of China, you've got, the Khans and the Singhs as two sort of predominant family names, or there are other royal families, but expect some sort of bloodline to rise to an India-dominated set of nations, right? I'm not sure what happens in Iran with Persia, as they're known in the Gog War. That could be again that sort of intermix of strongmen and or bloodlines. So anyways, look for all of that as sort of what might be underneath the assembly of the 10 groups of nations that happens. And what is going on with that shuffling today, we're going to be seeing what's involved in the beginning of sorrows, which will get stronger. So you're going to have wars and rumors of wars, right? That are going to be working with contrived pestilence. You're going to be working with famine that is an outreach of wars, and you're going to have the natural disasters, which won't be. There'll be contrived earthquakes that will also cause pestilence and famine, and they'll be working together as this gets stronger. Even it's going to seem like Armageddon is upon us, but it won't be yet. Even so much so that what happens in Revelation 6, when there's only 25% destruction. So we'll have this destruction before and in the time of the sorrows, and then we get this destruction in Revelation 6 that is 25% of the whole world and the population. And it's the same catastrophes, and they hide in caves at the end of Revelation 6 because they think it's the day of the Lord. But there's 33% destruction coming in, and then the wrath bowls and Armageddon. So
just wait.
And Jesus is laying out all those events, wars and rumors of Matthew 24, wars and rumors of wars, earthquakes, so forth. And he said that if it wasn't for the elect, God wouldn't put a stop to it, and there'd be no life left.
And we talk about a quarter, and that's why he steps in. And what's really interesting in Revelation 6 is you get wormwood, and there's so many different theories about there. But again, if we sort of understand what is being talked about from a Jewish perspective with wormwood, that word comes up in the Old Testament. Really? And wormwood was like a poison, like hemlock, or a derivative of hemlock, a poison. So there's this star that is a poison thing, if you understand that from an Old Testament perspective. And so you're talking about, is it like mass biological warfare? Or is it something even more connected to what's going on in a country that we've been talking about? And there was a nuclear issue back in the 80s there was Chernobyl,
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
right? And that could be disease. Now, most people don't know this, that in the language, not Russian, but in the country that it's in, where Chernobyl is located, that means wormwood.
No kidding.
So that
The
could
wor-
be like a foreshadow or a
Ooh.
birth pang of what this wormwood's going to be. That in that
Interesting.
war that's going to kill 25% of the people, is that the disease of wormwood that we're going to get with the destruction of nuclear plants?
You know,
Nuclear bombs.
Thomas Horn from Skywatch has a book about wormwood. He has an alternative perspective on that. He thinks it's going to be an asteroid named Apophis, which is supposed to come around near Earth 2029, I think, something like that. It'll be at its closest point to Earth. It's projected to hopefully pass, Friday the 13th of April 2029. Apophis coming around. But he somehow links Apophis to wormwood through the etymology of the two words, which also could kill 25% or more of the population.
Well, Apophis would be more identified with the a parent god of the underworld in Egyptian mythology, right? Okay, that's where that comes from. And I don't rule out the possibility of a planet or a large asteroid or something that's coming close. But the trouble is with that is that it has to be done just perfectly. Otherwise, it's a complete extinction event if it gets too close, right? And we're only at 25%. So there needs to be a degree of accuracy in terms of how that's going to hit 25%. I mean, God would know if that's the case. The other thing is that's the same mythos that comes out of polytheism about Nibiru.
Oh, yeah.
I haven't heard of Nibiru. What's
Nibiru,
that?
Well, that's planet,
the 12th or 13th planet or whatever the number that they use for it, that Nibiru, will be coming back in. That's the home of the Anunnaki.
Oh,
the alien mythos, right? So,
it's on some ancient. I can't remember if it must be Mesopotamian, some ancient star chart or cartography. Show.
So I don't rule it out, but I do think that polytheism has a different lens on some of the catastrophes that happens. But again, I also look for the catastrophes to be man-made or done as opposed to natural. And so, but again, because we don't know, there's a lot of still obscurity, as best as we try and understand it, till we actually get closer to the events, we may not fully understand it. So we need to be open to that. But I would lean towards the understanding of the writers of the prophecy who were Jewish with John and trying to communicate it in English the best way he could, just as with Armageddon for the location. We need to understand it as his instructions are, as it's understood in Hebrew, that we get transliterated into Greece, that gets transliterated into English, which is not the plain of Megiddo, and it's probably more Mount Hermon. I'm going to cover that off from connecting to some research that's been done on that to Mount Zion, which is the other word for Mount Hermon, and it's the counterfeit Zion that is going to be established in the end time.
I am fascinated. I'm fascinated with bloodlines, and was curious. I mean, you mentioned a couple of potential bloodlines that we're watching every time we look at the news. You could be potentially seeing certain world leaders as a part of these ancient bloodlines. Do you ever suspect any of those bloodlines before us publicly here in North America? I don't know. Do you have any?
Well, I mean, yes, I do. To zero in on what Nick's talking about, you talk about, plagues. You talk about famines. You talk about, when we're dealing with the end times, and it seems like such a hard thing to imagine. But I mean, if you look at the medical ramifications from the recent,
past
solution,
2 years,
to the problem that's been going around, and then you look at the supply chain issues, and then you look at inflation from, And then you look at our response to what's happening overseas and the Keystone Pipeline being shut off, and just you can very easily. And then the thing that really gets me though is, and I say this as somebody who voted for him twice, but I had noticed in the Christian conservative community how there was a borderline deification of Orange Man, and so you think like, wow, it must be really hard to, but even the elect will be deceived. And I don't know if he was part of the bloodlines or not. We had a really good comment in there.
Well, from I mean, I liked a lot of policies of President Trump, and I liked a lot of things that he did, but he wasn't anti-world order. He just wanted a larger role for the U.S. Right?
Yeah. Okay.
And just as Putin isn't against the world order, he just wants a larger role than the Europeans want to give him. Yeah. Trump is the same way. Trump wants a larger role than what the European bloodlines want to permit, which is why they rose up against him, right? Yeah. Whereas you've got the current president in there who's willing to make sure America is reduced to a level of power and status so that it won't have that larger role. President Xi just wants a larger role, and he's going to be expanding his empire. So it's a matter of who's in control. So when we look at where does America fit in the end time, you can make two good arguments. One is going to lead one of those empires that would, you could imagine Mexico and Canada through the trading bloc, but maybe that's not quite yet evolved. And maybe what I didn't really foresee coming, because I thought Europe would split into two groups, and I thought Germany would lead one, and I think that's definitely going to happen. And then I thought England and France would lead the other half. But I'm thinking now with the Brexit thing is that you have something else that's forming, and you may see Canada, Britain, and the US, and possibly even Australia with that alliance that Biden negotiated coming in as being one of that group. And if that's the case, and you're focusing on the bloodlines, don't look at the pseudo blue bloods. Look at the bloodlines that would be heading that, and that if the US continues to lead from behind and not be a leader in the world, that you could easily see, not Prince Charles, but I think probably Prince William would be more likely, if we're in the fig tree generation, that will be the next leader that might be leading that group. And so, but I'm open to both, that it could be, whereas I always thought it would be, maybe one of the pseudo bloodlines of North America that comes to the top, or there's an extended bloodline that comes out of the Europeans that will be running that, but still sort of reporting back to the bloodlines of Europe.
Do you think, and what you're describing, by the way, very much has echoes of Oceania from 1984. Yeah. Which ironically kind of has an Atlantean echo to it, so it's like, who knows how that's going to develop. But as far as Nick's question, we had a cool comment about Melania being supposedly tied to the Romanovs, which I think is interesting. But do you think that Trump is one of those bloodlines, or do you think that they hated him because he was kind of a usurper?
Yeah, I think it's they really despised him from a lot of different aspects. So, there's not a whole bunch in his bloodlines that would show a lot of purity. But like a lot of the other presidents, there's some connections, but his aren't quite strong. But he was part of that left organizational structure as an oligarch, right? Mm-hmm. And he knew inside and out, for the most part, or knew enough from being from the inside about how they worked and what their strengths and what their weaknesses were. And so he would be fully armed, and I think he would have run in the Democratic Party, but they wouldn't let him. Yeah. So he switches from being a Democrat to a Republican who doesn't want him either.
Yeah, right.
But he's permitted to run, right?
But so the base did.
So when he comes up, I mean, he's hated by all the globalists that are part of the Democrats, And certainly progressive and further left is all globalist, and you can argue amongst the more central liberalists how much are globalists or not, but the established Republican Party is globalist and perpetual war, just as you have that same faction that's on the left. And so they were anti-Trump and lined up against him, right, as well. And so, but that doesn't mean he is like a messiah type of figure for Christians, although he did Christians a lot of good. He was just trying to tear down his opponents.
Yeah.
Wasn't necessarily for the good of Christians. It was a beneficiary of it because he needs that power base to be able to do that from.
Yep.
Yeah.
And a lot of the things that he did were bringing a lot of end time events together, like bringing the Abrahamic Accords for another group of nations that would be offsetting the Shia of Persia would be being formed that might even include Israel within that sort of alliance, right? And so he also got Jerusalem established. So he was still kind of working there. I think he just wanted a larger role for the U.S. and a larger role for his family to ennoble their bloodlines going forward, or to continue to do so, and have a long-term play on the governance of the rising empire or group of nation or trading bloc, whatever you want to call it, that would be centered in the United States.
Yeah. There's a great series of videos by probably Alexandra is her name. And she lays out, she kind of has an interesting worldview that, there's the light side and the dark side, and the dark side is satanic, the light side is Luciferian, but there are no real good guys. And that Trump is like on that Luciferian light side masquerading as a good guy. And
we don't want to be involved on their good versus evil in their dualistic religion, because both sides are polytheist, whether it's white magic or black magic, whether it's a good Nephilim or a bad Nephilim, whether it's a good witch or an evil witch.
A good witch or a bad witch. Yeah. Right.
Still part of the same pantheon who wants to destroy the descendants of Adam and Noah. So,
Interesting.
Especially with CRISPR technologies and the Green New Deal and all the
So I think it's an important thing within their cult and culture of what's going on, and there are rivalries, as sort of in and around all of that, but it's still polytheism, and we need to understand that.
I have a question for you. So I've heard the phrase Nephilim culture several times. And I wanted to ask you, what is Nephilim culture and how is it being propagated on us in light of current global events?
Yeah, so Nephilim culture is, imagine Sodom and Gomorrah, and this would be Rephaim culture after the flood, but the Gnostics look at Gomorrah as the seed of Nephilim creation before the flood, and Sodom as the location after the flood where the giants are recreated after the flood. And that Sodom and Gomorrah, as with all of the cities of the plain, or most fortified city-state fortresses, were built on a hill, like on a ground, right? And they were called cities of light, shining cities of light. And to them, Sodom was a shining city of light that had burgeoning knowledge, had giants, it had polytheist doctrine roaming that included everything that we understand from a Christian thing that's probably not quite right, that would be going on throughout that sort of culture. It would have had sacrifices, it would have been on steroids. And you would have had at the beginning the Baalim in Sodom walking amongst them, because Baal is thought to be the parent of the Raphaim or the Rapayu as they're depicted in the Ugaritic text, right? And so just as it was before the flood, this is a culture that's Atlantis, which would be that shining empire that they want to recreate in the end time, where you had all of this unbridled development of knowledge, this polytheist, liberal, religious sort of understanding. Unless you don't believe in the pantheon, then they're not tolerant of you. If you don't believe in their religious doctrines, then they're not going to be tolerant of you. And that there's this understanding of this interaction with the gods, or as in the alien mythos with the ancient aliens, that was part of that daily sort of basis. So all of the horrors that you can imagine from Sodom and Gomorrah as an example after the flood, and from Atlantis and any other of those civilizations that's depicted in Lord of the Rings, or I'm trying to think of that show that was on that was really, really popular and was antediluvian based, and this was the different War of the Kingdoms and stuff like that.
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones, yeah. With that,
okay.
That would be that type of culture that they're talking about. And it's important to keep that in context with one of the overarching signs to the end time that Jesus provides, that it's going to be like the days of Noah.
Yeah.
And those are the exact same words that are used in Genesis 9:29 to describe the life of Noah, the days of Noah, which was 600 years before the flood, when you had all of this antediluvian things going on that caused the flood, and 350 years after the flood that included the Rephaim, the recreation and the creation of Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plain after the flood.
Yeah.
Man, I learned so much every time we talk to Gary.
It's awesome. Yeah.
Jeez.
Thank God for the replay, because
Yeah.
every time it's like, okay, because Nick goes through.
It's so
and
dense.
Nick
So
does a
much.
really good at job at dissecting all of these into individual segments. So it's always fun. Like, these are my favorite ones to go back and rewatch at the computer when I have time to Google and just go off on the journey. You know,
I have a
That's
question.
such a cool.
You said something really interesting about ancient aliens. Do you anticipate some sort of, in light of what's happening currently globally, do you anticipate there's going to be some sort of formal disclosure happening within the next year or two? Are they coming to save us from ourselves? You know, what are your thoughts on that in light of what's currently going on?
There will definitely be a disclosure. It's just a matter of how nuanced and complicated and deceiving that it's going to be. So they have to create a scenario where they can create a plausible cover story and disguise for where the fallen angels are coming from. Right? And the fallen angels, we know they can have a changeling capability, so because they can take the form of a man and they can take a form of any gender that they want. But that's not the whole sort of group of aliens that we need to be concerned with, I think. They're part of it, and they could certainly represent a number of different kinds, but that presents a plausible technological answer to the age that we're in as to where they come from. Now, if you have giants that have survived, right, whether or not they're seen as the white elves in the Lord of the Rings, or the Tuatha De Danann, which is the same sort of representation, whether they're not fully as, they show up as large as the ancient ones or not, there's going to be probably creatures like them that show up in the end time, and they need to be sort of fitting into this universal sort of Babylon, as in that science fiction show about Babylon and the aliens, and there's going to be this galactic table of these aliens that we're going to be asked to have a chair at the table at, but we're going to have to fight for it. So where do these other sort of aliens might come from? I think it's the creations of the fallen angels, like on that sort of understanding of the greater Nephilim concept. So you have the little people, right? You have, so like the gray aliens, well, where would they fit in? Well, they're identical in descriptions to the gray gnomes, who look after genealogies and technology for the demigods, and have flying machines that come through portals, fairy shays, fairy mounds, just like aliens do. And they kidnap people and they do sexual experimentations on them. They send them back without memories, and they're trying to renew their genome and the ability to be able to reproduce. And there's three groups of the little people. Like there's ones that make the weapons, like as in the Lord of the Rings, you have the dwarves that lived in the earth and they make the weapons for. And you have, good-looking ones, and you have mischievous ones like the leprechauns. You also have another group, that's the fourth group, that's called the salamanders, which is a reptilian group, which are larger than the little people. And then you have what happened to the Nakash. Did they save any of those serpents that were walking, talking, intelligent beings before all of that was taken away for deceiving Eve? And did they take them off-world or in another dimension through a portal or whatever? So I think we need to understand that they created a lot of different creatures before the flood, probably recreated a number of those after the flood, and that they're going to show up as being advanced beings that are in like Star Wars. I think it was Babylon 5 was that show that I was talking about, right?
I used to
and
watch
that good
it all the
versus
time.
evil aspect.
There were the
of
shadows,
the dualism.
and it's like Valerians or something. The ones in the encounter.
They were like the angels as we would know them,
yes.
right? And
He
it
came
was
out
this
and he looked
dualism
all
fight between
right.
the same
dualism, light versus dark, yin yang. It's the same story over and over again.
And in the Star Wars version, this is the war that they want humankind to fight for, to win freedom away from the dark force of the world, or what's allegorized in Doctor Strange, where they're fighting the Dark Lord of the universe, and they want to win the Earth as that separate realm to be away from that Dark Lord, and they need to fight a battle to win that. And so they need to be able to make this case that we're one amongst many that are fighting the evil God of the Bible.
Oh yeah, I've heard that theory before. Yeah, which is actually pretty common in like layman occultism.
So roll that forward to these beings released in Revelation 9, sometime before the midpoint of the last 7 years. And you have the worst of the demons coming out from the sides of the abyss, and then you have the fallen angels that were the worst of the fallen angels and the impassioned ones that are coming out. And then you have them uniting with all the angels that weren't in the abyss. And you're going to have this war in heaven that's described in Revelation 12 and Daniel 8. And some of those starry hosts from the loyal angels are actually going to be thrown to the earth and trampled on, as the Daniel account provides for us. And this is going to be, will we see the war part that happens in another dimension where heaven is, where God lives? Probably not. Maybe, but probably not, because heaven is defined biblically as 3 different places. One's inside the firmament, so from the sun in, as I would understand that, and then outside the firmament, which is the rest of the universe, and then there's the place where God lives. Right. And so
are you saying that there are some angels that haven't fallen yet, that will fall?
Well, there might be. We don't know. What we do know is by Revelation 12, fully 1/3 will have rebelled. Right? And that's going to be at least 33 million. So, because there's 10,000 times 10,000, which is 100 million, could be an allegorical number, but it's going to be a large number of fallen angels. Not all of them are in the abyss. Only the worst of the ones went there. So there's still angels that are outside, and that they could be the ones who would recreate the Nephilim and the Rephaim in the end time, because they know their time is short. So we may not see the war part in heaven, but as they're cast down and as they're being chased down by the loyal angels led by Michael, we could see that war above our our skies and in the space just outside the earth. And that would be very, very similar to probably the wars that are depicted in the Rig Vedas with all of these powerful weapons and things that happen in the skies that they wrote down in their religious history. And I think that might have been reflecting the first war, the first rebellion, right?
Yeah.
And that the fallen angels lost. And so they're going to be with us from there on. But I think we're going to see, and they're going to need a cover story for what we're seeing above us if we're going to see any of that war. And then these ones that they capture, they're going to need a cover story for that as well.
Yeah, that's been the big debate in the non-Christian sort of New Age panspermia kind of community. The alien community is that like there are the Pleiadians, the good aliens, and then there are the grays or the ones from what is it? There's some sort of draconic star that so they've already laid the groundwork. But as Nick and I attest, all aliens are demons.
That's right.
Who cares,
there are no,
right?
Right.
Yeah.
Who cares?
Yeah,
They're all gonna be, but they've
Yeah.
laid that masquerading groundwork already. That there's gonna be some sort of cosmic battle over the soul and fate of humanity, and it's just like whatever. No, it's not. It's not gonna. It's not. If you're telling me it's aliens, I'm not buying it.
I'm out.
Yeah, I'm out. Yeah,
I'm out.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Gary Wayne and I are gonna be in a cave somewhere.
Yeah.
So, well, in fact, speaking of end times, we have a little over a half hour left. So I want to make sure that Nick gets. I have so many questions. I want to ask. I want to talk about Lilith. I want to talk about Antarctica, Tartaria, the fall of Solomon, all this different stuff, adrenochrome, Colossus, and the Nephilim. But Nick had a really prescient one, a really relevant, topical one that he wanted to get to. And we're both really interested in your opinion on this.
Well, in light of one world government and what's coming, and the battle between the
1,000 points of light,
all that new world order that's coming, I would be interested to know. So like with the fall of the ruble and the decline of the U.S. dollar, which is basically the reserve currency.
Oh yeah,
the global currency. What are your thoughts about a cryptocurrency becoming the currency of the new world order or one world government? Have you ever? I don't know if you've ever thought about
the fallout of.
I mean, this isn't anything that you write about in your book. I realize.
No.
Well,
that's because technology is advancing so fast. I mean, it's hard to know the end product of the mark of the beast. But what we do know is it's still developing, and all the technologies, whether or not it's quantum computing or it's AI and everything else that's going on in the healthcare industry, that's going to be sort of merged together. One has to have a cashless society, as we said it in layman terms before, but there has to be one, as we understand it, as we start to understand the technology now, that has to be able to work not only cashless, but within the digital world, but in a way that's going to be capable of working with AI and quantum computing and fit into that whole level of technology. And I think this Bitcoin has been allowed to develop to sort of work the bugs out before they take it over. Just as you see the Biden government now talking about trying to move to control it where they never did before.
And just this week.
Yeah. And then you have another branch that we need to be aware of. So I think that's ultimately going to be part of that whole buy and sell part of it, right? That's going to be used down the road. That's all interconnected into this greater beast system. That's going to be part of the implant mark system that people are going to be asked to receive. But there's this, and you hear about it now. I mean, you have the SWIFT banking and you have the Swiss banking, but it's the SWIFT banking one that people are really focused on in terms of how the U.S. monetary system sort of controls the world, which is sort of controlled still by the old money and the Swiss money in Switzerland, because all of the banking is there now, including the Rothschilds that moved there, that linked up with the money that went there from the Templars and to the Hospitallers or the Knights of St. John, who were already there. And then the Vatican money, once they got a hold of the Vatican Bank through the Jesuits and I'm trying to think of the specific order that was founded that took over. Anyways, it was Borgia. I can't quite come up with the name of the order right now, but he was a descendant of several of the popes, right? He's of royal bloodline. And he's the one who funds the Jesuits, who then becomes the third Grand Master in 1570, takes over the Jesuits. And then he and the King of Spain work together and they get control of the banking that they moved to Switzerland. So they got everything sort of there. That's still, the modern banking that we know it today, even though they say it's a little bit more recent. It's got right back to the time of the Knights Templar when it was being set up there. But that's the SWIFT banking that has a lot of the US-based leverages to it. Like you need the US and you need to have access to this. China has been working with Russia to set up a new system. They actually have a SWIFT system, but it's only about 20% as influential as the current one that's used by most of the world. So when you hear the language of them setting up a new system, so that the US doesn't have the ability and the Europeans don't have the ability to create such economic havoc, that's where this is really going to be heading. It'll be independent of anything that the West is going to be doing. That, again, could be part of that two legs of this empire that's being revived, that's going to happen, that's going to end be on, the 5 toes on each of the feet. So look more of that. And they want this, and particularly Xi wants this because he wants a larger role and to be the one calling the shots in the world.
Sure.
And he's gonna. I think he's gonna. He may let Putin dangle for a while, but he's going to ultimately save him through this system. And they've already got that limitless treaty. And that oil is going to be shipped to China, so they don't have to bring it in from other parts of the world. So even if you shut it off, which I don't necessarily disagree with, but they've already got those markets already set up in the second largest economy in the world, right? So, and you're going to see more of that economic union. And then as Xi advances, he's going to swallow up more countries that are going to be forced into his system. And then he's going to force Southeast Asia to be part of that. And that's why you see India standing on the sidelines right now in terms of what's going on in the war today.
Yeah. That's the interesting thing about it, is that long-term projection of like, okay, if China and Russia get in bed with each other, then this could look like World War III, but just economically, if nothing else. America gets Western civilization gets put into a secondary or auxiliary position.
Yeah, and let's face it, the U.S. cannot afford a war.
No, we really can't. On just about any level.
Yeah, over 30 trillion in debt. And I mean, who knows? I mean, what the deficit's going to be on an annual basis. They can't afford another war. So they, the policies that were enacted overzealously but intendedly, I think, to create a debt level through the pestilence that's just happened was intentional.
Yeah. Well, absolutely, especially after what happened with the election happened. And then after that, the first thing that gets done is the Keystone Pipeline gets shut down, and then, what do? We cut off, buying oil from Russia. And, we try to court Venezuela, but why would a lot of these countries want anything to do with us at this, because we are in such a weakened position, especially militarily.
Thanks, Brandon.
Yeah. Let's go. That's right.
And there's no need for the U.S. to be in this position. I mean, we all know that they could be the world's largest producer of oil, and that it's gone from, in 1 year, from being a net exporter to a net importer, and they had to buy from Russia throughout the year, funding what was going on, and the government knowing they were funding what was going on, and knowing that Russia, what they were going to do, and at the same time cutting off all of the arms that Trump was providing, the oppressed nation that is being talked about today, and that even as it increased with military numbers around the borders, that reinstatement of the supply of arms, or producing more oil to be self-sufficient, was reenacted to start coming about. I mean, all of that is you'd have to be an absolute village idiot.
Yeah,
which is plausible, I suppose, considering who's
yeah,
running the country right now.
Uh-huh.
But I think it's by design that they knew this war was coming.
Yeah.
And they created the scenario to fund it, and then and I think they wanted the destruction. I think they wanted that. I think it's about the New World Order, and they're just painting Putin today because as this madman, because he's not doing it in the way that they want, but he was going to get some of this anyways. They just don't want him to get all that he wants, right?
Yeah.
They just want to sort of limit that, and that's what it's really all about. And it's how do you, if we're going to be moving into this new world order that's envisioned by the European bloodlines, that the U.S. has to be brought down a level significantly, how do you get there fast enough in the timetable that they want to bring it about in? You have to destroy the U.S. economy. And the Russian economy is not going to be destroyed. It's just going to go elsewhere.
Yeah, it'll just shift.
Yeah.
The pieces just shift on the board.
And then what I find really interesting is how you have these certain laboratories where you're creating pestilence opportunities that's akin to what happened in another Asian country.
Yeah.
And you don't do anything you don't do anything in all of the time that you get the buildup. I mean, even as late as March, but you could go back even earlier with that war in 2014 where they took the Crimea. There was nothing to prepare to get these scientific beasties that they've created out of that country to protect them. All of this is going on. I mean, why wouldn't you do that unless you didn't want to? I mean, it absolutely makes no sense other than that's what they wanted. And so we'll have to see how this sort of all plays out. But Russia gets what it wants, but in a more painful way that they're hoping is going to affect it down the road from expanding as far as they want to go. But it won't help because they've got China backing them.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Hey, Gary, I have a question. I'm going to put it up here on the screen. It's from Joey Payne, who just happens to be my mom, by the way.
Shout out, Joey.
I'm so glad she's watching. It's awesome.
Miss you.
She, like me, she's a big fan, and she always enjoys our conversations.
When we told her
that. Her question is, what do you think about Bill Gates' patent number? Which is so interesting when you look it up. The patent number 06666 application having to do with a Bitcoin technology that tracks whether you are a human or an AI doing the activity.
Wow. Yeah, they broadcast who they are, what they're all about, and their intentions all the way through.
Telegraphing. Yeah.
There was, I write it in the book, and it's kind of a little bit ancient right now, but there was a company called Mondex, who was really a force for moving to chip technology and the credit cards and the cashless society. And of course, they chose an address in New York City. I can't remember the name of the street, the number of the street, but their address was 666. I mean,
of course it was. Why not?
They broadcast it all over the place, just like any of the companies. Their iconology and their names are usually rooted in.
It's like when all the rappers do this, when they all hold their, it's broadcast all the time. Well, and that chip technology, you wouldn't think, I bet when social security numbers came out, everybody was pretty intense about the mark of the beast thing, because it's like you couldn't do a lot, and then the barcodes came out and people were upset over that.
Yeah, but like and the 3 bars that are missing are that aren't numbered are 6, 6, and 6, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I've heard of that before.
Yeah, and just sort of, I'll just interrupt you just for a second. So you have to understand the beast system and the beast empires. They're ready at whatever level of technology to implement their system, right? So if they had found a way to bring about the end time in the 80s, they still would have had the same type of numerals and geomancy involved that this higher tech stuff will have.
Geomancy. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Dude, geomancy. That's such a perfect word for it.
And
Yeah.
tying into that, Brian Tucker says that Gates was quoted as saying, "We can control the population through vaccines."
Yeah.
Well, of course
as
they
a part
can.
of one of those tools that they have ready to go.
Through as Davos said in I think 2017, they wanted that through an implant system that would self-medicate everybody.
Oh, sign me up, please.
But that makes sense when you look at the word sorceries in the book of Revelations, which is the Greek word pharmakeia. It's actually
pharmakeia,
pharmakous and pharmakos, but I mean that is how they're going to medicate people to a certain degree through a digital system, which we have not that mark system in place yet, or the technology of medication with the mRNA, but it's a digital messaging type of system that is still developing that would be part of that down the road, which would merge into that whole digital chip system that we're talking with all those other technologies we're talking about a little earlier, and that people will demand that for better health and longer life. And they imagine the chip in 2017, they said the chip system will come through the delivery system of healthcare.
Oh my gosh. Which is why healthcare has been given so much authority over our lives.
Now, sorceries or pharmakeia can also mean a spell, as a magic spell, as you take that out of its etymology. And it also means drugs, both legal and illegal. So it can also be part of all of the pharmaceutical drugs as well. And that word sorceries is there for a reason in the King James Version Bible. Yeah. So the secret societies who created the Royal Society, which were the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians, that is the center of all scientific development and education outside the church in the West today, called themselves the last of the sorcerers and the first of the scientists.
Oh, wow.
And that word, as it's used in Revelation 18:23, if I've got the verse correct, is through these sorceries does Babylon seduce and deceive the world.
Yeah.
Either way, it's fallen angel technology.
Yeah. Nephilim culture.
Yeah.
You know? Well, that's the frightening thing about it is, and they've been pushing for this. Like you say, if they could have done this back in the 80s, they would have done it. If they could have done it in the 90s, they would. And I remember reading, I was into end times prophecy back when I was such a weird little dork. When I was in early high school in 8th grade, I used to read these books, we'd get them from Lifeway. And I remember they talked about, one of the things they talked about, because this was during the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, was when they first started implanting little chips into dogs, and now just last week I saw a video where a lady had a chip implanted in her wrist that would allow her to unlock the door to her house, unlock the bathroom, unlock the nightstand, and I'm just does no one connect the dots?
Well, now go back, and again, like I say, things are always developing, but and they're ready all the time if the opportunity comes. But the Mondax company I talked about is they were intent that this chip system that they were developing for the credit cards would at some point in time not serve its proper purpose because of security issues, that it would have to become an implant.
No kidding.
Yes. And they found through their research that based on the technology that they had at the time, that the best location for security and application and protected was either in your right hand or your forehead.
Oh, that's right. I remember seeing something about that with the whole luciferase aspect. The guy who invented the luciferase angle of the jab, talking about how that same thing, that it would have to be implanted in your right hand or in your forehead for the most. And you know what? They laid the groundwork for all this years or decades in advance. The temperature checks, back when the Wuhan flu first kicked off, everywhere you went, you'd have to, have a temperature check, especially at the dentist. And I used to tell them all the time, listen, I've been shot at So like you put anything like a gun at my head, like I don't play the game,
Oh, yeah.
you know. And so the alternative,
It's got that unnerving feeling.
it really, well, it's like cattle, you know,
Yeah.
like they euthanize cattle with the air gun, you know, like that's how it makes you feel. It's the medical world is so dehumanizing now because of this. It's such a psyop. Like Gary, I'll tell you, I think we may have mentioned it before, but when as a quick aside, when the first case hit Williamson County where we live, I was working a security job and they had a hard time. They were, at the moment, they had not enough bottled water for this performance, for the show that they were going to do. It was at a theater. And so they were already kind of out looking for bottled water. And within an hour of that, of them finding out on the radio that the first case had broken in Williamson County, you couldn't find water anywhere. And I remember getting this sick feeling in my stomach, like this. I remember literally thinking the words, this feels like witchcraft. This feels like some sort of hex, some sort of spell that has been cast over people, because it's something other than just, because mass psychosis can happen.
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
But it's something other. There's something nefariously supernatural that's going on with this sort of thing. And that temperature thing, they'll do it on your head or they'll do it on your wrist somewhere. Anyways.
Yeah, they accomplished so much in preparation for world government and world religion through this last pestilence, and pushed the boundaries, learned everything they could do. I mean, you saw what happened in Canada with the War Measures Act that didn't hit their threshold for having it in, but the whole left voted for it in Canada, so it became ability. And then they started to seize, GoFundMe and the other place. They seized, I don't know, something like 400 bank accounts. People can't have, they took their driver's license away, they were taking their trucks away, they were losing their ability to work completely. And most people didn't object.
That's the scary thing.
That's the scary thing.
It happened here with cash. You talk about a cashless society. You remember in the first probably, 6 to 8 months of the pestilence breaking out, all of a sudden gas stations and grocery stores and stuff weren't giving you change back. And you were discouraged. There were a lot of articles that went out that discouraged you from using cash because supposedly it would, transmit the virus. And it's just, of course, use your credit cards. That if Bank of America decides they don't like your Twitter feed, they can cancel. And
the big thing that they're pooling their information on as to where they are at right now is they weren't aggressive enough, and they need to learn from the mistakes that they made so that they could be more totalitarian the next go around and how to do it.
Right?
So,
Yeah. They didn't quite do a
They
good
didn't
enough
pull
job
it off
this
the
time.
just perfectly. Exactly. I have a question for you, more related to AI and Web 3.0 and everything that's coming to us on that end, and how it might tie into all this. What are your, and again, this is not something that, this is a bit of a curveball question. I just want your opinion.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Gary. We had a list.
It's just it's so great talking to you because I love your perspective.
Yeah. I hope you're okay with that.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on the metaverse?
Oh yeah. Is that part of Nephilim culture too?
Well, sure it is. Sure it is.
Association of the human body.
Yeah, so the metaverse is this whole matrix system that they're talking about, right? That's based on sacred science and sacred geometry, sacred math, advanced technology. And this is the world that they're trying to bring in. And they believe in polytheism, that the world is a computer matrix, right?
Yeah.
And that this is a projection, and the whole world is based on this geomancy, that, and the codes that they have. You need to look past beyond like being a diviner and stuff like that, and into the mathematical parts of the geomancy as you dig into that. And that if we understand that that's what they're trying to do, and we see these things like a virtual world, they're just trying to recreate what they think is already here as a virtual world, right? And that this is
control, and they're gods of,
because they ain't gonna be in it.
Well, that they control. I mean, that's the big thing of AI and silicon-based life forms versus carbon-based life forms is that God created those, but we want to be God.
Right. So what was the question again? Because I kind of
I'm sorry. Yeah, that
No,
was
no,
my
it's
fault.
just
My
your
bad.
opinion on the metaverse, and
yeah. So that's what I was looking for. I couldn't quite get that. And so when we look at how they named it, it will tell you something, and that it is a short version. It might be an acronym of some sort, but that's not how they always work. So like CERN, they say, is an acronym, but it's actually CERN was the god, which is a Pan type of god, an Azazel type of god, Satyr god, as at least in the degraded form in the Etruscan pantheon, which was there before Rome, right? Or Cernunnos, which is the same god in the Druidic pantheon. So that's not an acronym, it's the name of a god, and it's the name of the destroyer god, right? Yeah, that Azazel is, and bad Napoleon. So when we look at meta, I would look into Metatron. And Metatron is the Enoch son of Cain in the third book of Enoch, who raises himself up to be an angel-like status and even to the son of God-like status through the knowledge that he developed. And his name was changed to Metatron once he became at that level. And Metatron is the name of the spirit that is guiding a lot of the scientists and the people that are working on a lot of this digital technology and providing the things that they need to develop it. So anytime you see meta, you need to be thinking in terms of the Nephilim fallen angel technology and knowledge, just as you've been talking about, because they're going to label it. So even when Facebook changes their group company name to the Meta, that is what he's telling us is he's positioning his social media and his corporate oligarchical company is going to be part of that system that's coming, the beast system, and it's going to be a major part that they call the metaverse.
I know it.
Yeah.
Yep.
There's nothing new under the sun. All that has come before.
And it's amazing they telegraph. I think they telegraph because they know that the people who call them out on it are going to be they're just going to be labeled as
labeled as religious kooks.
Kooks, conspiracy theorists, so forth.
Yeah.
Well,
and it'll only further validate what they're doing.
And it works because what they have been doing and what they intend to bring about is of such a scale, of such complex nature, of so many different parts, that most rational people would, rightfully just say, that's crazy talk. Nothing that big could be that secret. And they're right. They don't even try and keep a secret of it. They hide it in plain sight. And they know that people have been brainwashed because they've been preparing them, that they know that they won't even have a clue what's coming at them, even though they told us.
You're right. Yeah, they warned us.
Yep.
That's how they do it. They warn you every time, and all the answers are there. The telegraphs are there. They're just all encoded, or they're slightly esoteric, or they're sometimes pretty blatant, like media. I mean, we use the term media all the time. Well, that was a goddess. But everybody's got. Everybody has a day job. Most people have kids. It's just they don't have time to do this, and they're banking on that lackadaisical, attitude towards all of this.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. And the media is they're playing their part perfectly, particularly with the current war that's going on, and all of the focus is on Russia right now, and there's no focus on China, who is the one that is making it happen. Right. And there's nothing, and he's watching it strategically because they play things from a lot higher level than the village idiots running our countries lately in the last few years.
Brains.
They're watching everything that is happening for their plays to come. So they get a chance to see how they should do it, and they'll do it better than what Putin has been doing it.
Well, and that's the fascinating psyop aspect of what's happening over there right now is that, here's one little country that, and it's not little. Here's one country that had no real bearing on most people's lives. It really doesn't matter for most people. But man, if you look at social media, if you look at the news, if you look at anything on TV, it's all stand with those guys, support those guys, protect those guys, and then they vilify the other side, but yet they ignore the fact that it's far more complicated than that. I mean, there were biolabs that they were going after. There's been a civil war for the past probably 10 years now, and
the
ever
people
since 2014, the Minsk Treaty was violated by the puppet government that was set up.
And the majority of the people in the assaulting country, the offending country, they're destitute now. They don't want what's going on, but they're being vilified.
Right.
They're being vilified
on Facebook,
in sports.
Did you see that, Gary? That
and they're like,
we
didn't want to do this.
Yeah,
we feel,
Yeah. Now they know how we feel.
Now they know how the American conservative feels. Like, I know it's not my fault.
And take the two examples of the catastrophes.
Yeah.
One that begins in China, one that begins in Russia. You can't speak against or do anything to the Chinese, people-wise, media-wise. But you can do anything, against the Russians, and that's why when you see that much unanimity and focus, you have to start asking critical questions about the disinformation that we know our fake news provides us every day. They lie all the time, so we have to be able to weed through what's going on there. And this whole idea, that the president says, "Well, I knew sanctions weren't going to work anyways." Well, that's not what he said before, but they knew, and they didn't do anything to stop this beforehand. They were just trying to, I think, poke them in the eye to get them to do it. I mean, shortly before the war happens, you have the vice president going over there and working on, the policy of the White House, saying, we want Ukraine to join NATO. I mean, could you poke the bear anymore, so to speak?
Right. Yeah. And they have been poking the bear for the better part of, I think, 5 or 6 years now, stacking their troops over there. That's why all that conflict is taking place on the eastern side.
Yeah.
And it's just,
And now this poking of the bear that's saying that, well, we would let the Ukraine into the EEC. That's not going to happen. That's just making everything justified in Putin's mind. And I'm not defending Putin in any way. I mean, he should not be invading countries. He's an evil. But you know what? We got the same type of people running our governments.
Right. Well, because it kind of is a puppet government set up by the Western controlling powers. And, and I've heard a bunch of crazy, well, I wouldn't say crazy because I kind of believe them, but a bunch of esoteric stuff about, Ukraine being like the sex trafficking hub of Eastern Europe. And
Billionaires Playground.
Billionaires Playground plays into that whole adrenochrome cabal kind of thing,
sure.
And then it's a government set up by the Western banking syndicate powers, that violated their own treaty from 2014, and then was a host to a bunch of biolabs, many of which were apparently mobile, that have been being hit. So, and I don't know how true any of that stuff is. I kind of hold that in an open hand, because I can't verify it.
Well, what we do know, according to what's her name? Is it Ruland? Victoria Newland, who testified before the Senate committee this week, is that there are those biolabs there, and that they are very fearful of what happens if they fall into the Russian hands. But yet, these are the people that did nothing to protect them or safeguard them or get that stuff out beforehand when they had lots of time. So we know they're there. They're saying that they didn't create it. They're not saying that they didn't fund it, or they didn't set up shell companies that funded it. We've seen that sort of MO on other biological developments that could cause the extinction of humankind. But that's, it seems to be the same sort of MO. So we know they're real. We just don't know how dangerous they are. But if she is that fearful, I wonder what Frankenstein things that they developed in there, because
Right.
they didn't destroy them. The scientists, as the head of the agency over these biological departments in the government, said in the US that scientists do what scientists do. They froze them, they kept them, and they do what scientists do. They were manipulating them just as one other virus that we know about.
Yeah, they were, and supposedly trying to develop something new that was based off of the bubonic plague, according to what I read. And apparently, the Russian forces are, again, this is apocryphal. This is what I've heard, so it's just rumor. But the Russian forces are trying to eliminate those biolabs as opposed to seizing them. Now, how true that is, I can't verify one way or the other.
I'm not convinced of them because they took over those labs from the Russians.
Oh yeah, wasn't Chernobyl? Was Chernobyl one of them, or was Chernobyl supposedly like one of the sex trafficking conduits? Do you have any information about that?
In terms of a biolab being there?
Yeah, in terms of biolab.
Well,
Yeah.
no, the only thing I know about Chernobyl is that it was a nuclear accident that was there,
Yeah.
right? But again, I mean, was under the Soviet Union. They had, I mean, dozens and dozens of these locations all over the Ukraine at the time, and Chernobyl would be, an apropos place that would be sort of fitting into locating things that were sort of where you could have, a number of scientists working on a number of different things and sort of set areas, right? Because it's more efficient to do that. So it would make sense. I don't have any evidence to suggest that there was one specifically there, but I would not be surprised. I would expect that there would be, some biological developments that were going on there.
Yeah. Do you want to?
I'm done. I'm done with questions.
All
No,
right.
I want to move on to yours.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, so where do you think it goes? And we're probably like right at the 2-hour mark, so I don't want to take up too much of your time, Gary. But we'll take you for as long as we can have you.
Absolutely.
I'll tell you that.
Absolutely.
So maybe this should be like, unless you say you have more time, maybe this should be like a good parting question for you.
Yep.
For now.
Yep.
Where do you, if anywhere, see this going with what we're looking at with world events right now in the near future?
More of the same.
Yeah.
Learning from what happens here. We're in the shuffling of creating the groups of nations. We're in the period, if we're in the fig tree generation, that we're going to see more pestilence. We're going to see more famine. We're going to see more wars and rumors of war. And it's going to set up a period of time and look for this, that there's going to need to be the true false prophets come onto the scene. And these are going to be stronger and more religious in nature to the apocalyptic prophecies that we get with the sorcerers within science that we have today, predicting apocalypse by global warming, apocalypse by this, but it'll be in that apocalyptic theme to drive people into and cattle herd them into the arms of the globalists and into world government and a world religion. But it's going to require targeting these birth pangs or sorrows as coming together and working in unanimity in a way that they're going to predict them by false prophets and saying, if you do not convert and if you do not do these things that will bring about the new Babel, we're going to destroy ourselves from the face of the earth. So I don't know from how many different angles this is going to come from, but what I do know is if you look at Medjugorje, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with Medjugorje or not, and the Mary apparitions, but those 6 that were initiated in the 90s were given a specific date to come out on, and they have 10 apocalyptic prophecies that will get stronger as they go, and they will come out and say, if the world doesn't convert to the one true religion, this disaster is going to happen. And if you don't convert by the time the 10th comes, the whole world will be destroyed. And they're going to drive people into this religion through fear. Now, there has to be some more changes that would come if it comes up through the Roman Catholic religion, which, you know, I don't know whether you're aware of, in about 2017, Francis took control over the whole Medjugorje scenario and situation, and recognized officially a number of the apparitions, and is overseeing all of that. So one would expect that that's going to come out. That doesn't mean there won't be false prophets from other religions and stuff that are coming out, but expect that type of pattern, so that this one true religion that's going to come out is going to be able to reel in the whole world to convert to that religion, and have an umbrella type of basis about it. So you can have different denominations, so to speak. But the one religion that's not going to be permitted will be Christianity.
I noticed that when I worked at, I had an office job, a corporate office job, and I noticed it. Well, pretty much in any group setting that was secular, you can, part of the New Age system, you can mention any deity or any religion or holy text you want. But if you start quoting from the Bible, or if you mention Jesus, people get really uncomfortable if they're non-believers.
Well, that's what secular means. It means non-Christian.
Non-Christian. And so, right. Yeah. So exactly what you say is that New Age thought process, everything but Christianity.
Yeah, and so they will try and discredit and de-deify Jesus. They will want a remnant of Christianity that is going to fit into the polytheist religion. Expect them to hit monotheism at the Moses level, because it connects into Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, and they're going to say he was a polytheist from Heliopolis, and that was the true religion that went rogue. Expect that as part of what is going to come. I would also expect that they will continue with what they tried to do with Paul at the time of the Gospels, as being the heretic and the evil liar that comes out of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're going to basically say he's a heretic, and that only his writings take Jesus to godlike status, although that's not true as you understand and read the four Gospels. But they'll also eliminate the book of John as well, because they hate that as well. And then re-allegorize through allegorical meanings what's written in the Bible, so it fits in with polytheism. So there's a lot of things that sort of need to come together, but things come together quickly when you get those false prophets that are going to come about, that is going to bring that universal religion about, and through all these other catastrophes that they're predicting, will be the glue that establishes those 10 kings, those 10 groups of nations, for the new Atlantis, for the new age that they want to bring about.
Wow.
Well, you know, last time we talked, and this is a little bit off topic. Last time we talked, and this time, I know Jonathan's been wanting to ask you a question about Lilith, I think.
Oh, yeah.
And I know last time we didn't get to it, and I don't want this time to get by enough because this is really interesting.
I mean, I'm just curious about that. I would like to, at some point, have you expound upon Lilith, you know, as whatever you have to say about her, because there is a great chapter in your book about Lilith. The Genesis 6 Conspiracy has a fascinating chapter about Lilith, mentioned once, it seems, biblically, and then, but yet has remained part of the cultural zeitgeist and has become such a popular thing. Yeah. So she was a character in a couple of the Angel novels, which, by the way, after your second book comes out, I think I'm going to have to rewrite all 7 of the Heavenly Realms novels in order to fit a more accurate cosmology, you know. But she was one of the topics that I did want to ask you about at some point. So, well,
I mean, it is an important goddess figure, right? She's, I look at her more of almost a demigod. In terms of the research that I've done on her, and through the lineage of Tiamat, which is a Leviathan dragon type character of the parent gods. So from that aspect, could be not a demigod, but an offspring god. You could look at it from the gods that Lilith is created. And she's also called the Queen of Heaven, which is the really sort of nexus point where it comes into. Are you guys still there?
We're still
Yeah,
here.
Okay,
we're
I
still
just
here.
lost your camera. Yeah.
Sorry, we're changing cameras.
We're
'cause the
switching over
battery
cameras
ran
on
out.
us. Yeah.
So
That's
if
right.
we
Queen of
understand that Mary apparition is called the Queen of Heaven,
Yeah.
and we understand the Queen of Heaven is in the Bible as being like the Ashtaroth gods, and called in the book of Jeremiah. This is the mother goddess aspect that's going to have to come back as part of this dual religion that has a god and a goddess in that old infrastructure. So that part of the duality's got to be coming back. And the Sibylline prophecies that came on Palatine Hill, one of the seven hills of Rome, and they considered their goddess as the Queen of Heaven as well. There, you get this imagery that sort of, and I'm just sort of doing this quickly because it's a fairly long topic, but you get this imagery that is coming about that is going to sort of resurface as part of this Babel religion that's coming back, and who is represented in Revelation 12 as the description that those 6 children saw in their apparitions, as is a similar description to the other Mary visions and all the Mary visions, from Joan of Arc to Ignatius of Loyola to Fatima. It's all a very, very similar description. And remember, we have a woman that is riding the beast empire, which is the end time mystery religion, because the mother goddess was actually thought in ancient times to be as important or more important than the male god. It was not only the fertility goddess and a war goddess, right? And sort of
Athena,
yeah.
Isis,
So
Ishtar.
we need to be aware of that Queen of Heaven aspect that is going to become more prominent.
Mm-hmm.
Man, that is so awesome. I really want to touch on that more next time we're able to talk, because it seems like there is such a corollary between Lilith and then this feminine divine concept that is, and whether that's the Whore of Babylon or what that is exactly, it just seems to be this this thing meant to lead people astray.
Yeah, and known in Gnosticism as Sophia and wisdom.
Sophia, that's right. Yeah.
And of course, you see that coming up with AI and artificial intelligence and names and things like that. Oh,
that's right. Yeah.
So,
Siri.
expect. So you have that Queen of Heaven that shows up in all the polytheist cultures around the world, and it's been created within Christianity to be accepted, just as Mary Magdalene is thought to be sort of an allegorical Queen of Heaven as well, and is the one that is, the Gothic cathedrals was named after. And of course, in Gnosticism, she's the one who marries Jesus, because Jesus doesn't die on the cross, and that's one of the ways that I think they're going to de-deify Jesus and created offspring that goes into, the Camelot dynasties. Through Joseph of Arimathea taking Josephus, the third son, over there. And then there's an intermarriage between Aragon of the Camelot dynasties, who's a descendant of Josephus, and Amenemhat of the Merovingian dynasty, that ennobles that dynasty into those Nephilim bloodlines, and two off the Dodonan dynasties of Camelot, the shining city on a hill. It is the bloodlines of the grail dynasties, and those are the bloodlines that extend out of Dagobert, the last survivor of the Merovingians, whom I know this is long. Hugh de Payon, Godfrey de Bouillon, and Anjou, all of the Lorraine region, that take their bloodlines back to Dagobert, who has those genealogies. And of course, it's the Anjou that kept the King of Jerusalem title crowned to them in 1118, which they want to take as a title at the Abomination, and that passed down eventually through Hungary, and then back into the Lorraine region, over to the Habsburg Lorraine dynasty. Currently rests with the Bourbon family, which is the bloodline of the kings of France and King Philippe, son of Juan Carlos, who has the King of Jerusalem title today. But within the Anjou bloodline, there's some rivals to the King of Jerusalem title, so one shouldn't be too surprised about that. But
for your next book, you should have an illustrator create
a
some
chart
a tree,
like Clarence Larkin
like
did for the Spirit
bloodline,
World.
bloodline, like timeline, like family.
That'd be so cool. Yeah,
it'd be so huge, though.
I'd buy it. I'll pay for it.
It'd be huge. It'd be a book. It'd be a book of genealogies, and I don't know if you get it all into one. And it gets so wide through the generations, right?
Yeah.
And then the intermarrying of the different bloodlines and the scioning that they do too. But people have said that, but it's a project that is so large that
dude, that could be your third book.
No, maybe it's your third book.
Yeah, or whatever. Who knows? Well, I was looking it up as you were talking, because I actually was listening to you on the Rima Faye podcast. You had done an interview there about King Arthur and also some parallels with Lord of the Rings and Tolkien and stuff. That was an excellent interview. That was really fun to listen to, and we had talked about a little bit of that in the past, but to hear you do a deep dive on Lord of the Rings and the antediluvian parallels and how it ties into the bloodlines and King Arthur and all that stuff it's really cool. Yeah. It was a lot of fun. So, man, Gary, this has been awesome, dude. Thank you. This has been fun. Is this interview 2 or interview 3? I've lost.
This is the third.
This is the third interview,
with
you, right?
Yep.
Yeah, that's right. Man, they're so much fun. We always are. First of all, we're very honored that you would come on, and we always enjoy talking to you.
And Brian Tucker says Gary is a saint. I agree.
Thank you, Brian.
Time.
Yeah, we had some good comments too. I want to thank Brian Tucker, Pam Wachowski, Heather Ann, and Joey Payne. Big shout out to Joey.
Yep.
She's awesome.
Yep.
And Gary, people can find you at the Genesis6conspiracy.com, correct? Yep. And then you're on Twitter as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm not active on Twitter yet.
Okay.
I used to be, but not anymore because for obvious reasons, I'm not happy with them.
Yeah.
So just on Facebook, on my timeline, and on Messenger. That's the only social media I have. I'm hoping things come a little bit more clear where I should be active on, but I don't want to add more work for something that I'm not going to be,
totally understood,
doing for a long period of time. So hopefully by the time the book comes out, I'll make some clear decisions on that.
And where's the best? Would Facebook be the best place to follow you for that, or do you have an email that people can sign up for?
There's an email on the website, so either place, Messenger or on my timeline, or there's a group that's got my name on it. I try and check in 2 or 3 times a week and answer questions and stuff there, or on the email on my website. But I will get back to you. It just may not be in the first couple of days. So
yeah, well, hey man, you're busy, and there's a lot of research that you are always doing. Can't wait for your second book to come out. Yeah, Gary Wayne, the master of the mythological, the how would you put it, the mighty man of the Nephilim culture destruction. Taking down Nephilim culture, one giant at a time.
The illuminator of all that is behind the curtain.
That's right. Yeah. There you go. Gary, thank you, man. This has been so awesome. I would love to talk to you again sometime. And we always enjoy our time with you, even though we went a little bit over. I appreciate you indulging us.
Yeah,
so.
Terrific. It's been fun. Hopefully, I made some sense for the audience today.
Oh, dude, this was so awesome. I can't wait to see how Nick breaks all these up. And,
I've got a dozen. I've got a dozen different things that I'll chop this video up into different segments.
Yeah.
But this has been great. This has been really fun. I got another almost 2.5 hours with Gary Wayne. This has made my month. I mean, this is fantastic.
Yeah, it's fine. I'm telling you, man, come down to Tennessee. It gets pretty warm. We'll take shooting.
Yeah,
we got a bunch
shooting.
of guns.
Yeah, absolutely.
It'll be great. All right, Gary. Love you, buddy. Thank you again.
Thanks again, Gary.
Have a great evening.
Yep.
All right, we'll see you later.